welcome to another episode of REDtalks.live, your home of ranting engineers and DevOps. And we have a friend of the show returning again, Mr. Ken Lang. Ken, say hi.
Hello there. Thanks for having me back.
It's delightful to have you back. We had such a good chat last time about APIs and API-first strategy. I thought a really good logical follow-on conversation would be API contracts, or as I like to affectionately call them, API parenting. So that practice of just looking after it. And this is a good natural follow-on from the episode published last week with GitHub engineer Christian Weber, where we talked about the responsibility of going open source. When you go and decide to release something in an open source model where you share your code publicly, that you have a responsibility to take feedback, to welcome feedback, to even review pull requests. It's not just dump to the world, mic drop, and I'm out of here. And I guess to me, this API contract, or API parenting, as I love to call it, is kind of that version. Would that be a fair way of summarizing it again?
Yeah, I like the API parenting because I think it elevates it beyond just the technical. And some folks think API contract is purely about, schema testing and other testing, which it is. Don't get me wrong. That's definitely the core where you want to start. But the contract is a lot of the more, human elements, the business elements. So parenting, I think, works well.
Well, I used to say governance, but I think that's the wrong word. And that's governance, like governing, that sounds restrictive, whereas like API parenting's more like you take into account behavioral things. Like what am I going to say in my documentation, how it behaves if you flooded, or maybe I'm going to rate limit you for a reason, those kind of things. So that's where I kind of pivoted from governance to more parenting, because you're there for its development and the way it's perceived in the world.
Well, and parenting, you have to be careful how you behave at home behind closed doors, because sometimes those behaviors will come out in public, and you'll scream at your children in restaurants or other things, and do things that maybe you shouldn't. So I think, and then the other is setting an example for your children that they do as you do. And so yeah, I think it's a great analogy.
So I made a bullet list of things that I think are really good. We won't go through the whole lot. I did a bit of research on this topic. There's way too many to mention, but I want to just fire off a couple and get your kind of take on these, because I think they're important things to consider when you're going to bring an API to market, of how you should be responsible. And my favorite, and probably one of the most important, is deprecation policy. Why should people care about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about APIs that, APIs, one camp believes APIs can go away at any moment. Other people say you'll have to support the grandchildren of the developers using your APIs. Right now, you can never deprecate. But the reality is somewhere in the middle, that you should, when you first design and define and deploy your API, you should have some sort of strategy for at least what cycles you're going to evolve and change and release, and communicate those cycles out, and then have some sort of deprecation policy that's, hey, we're only going to support 1 or 2 or 3 versions back, or on special cases we'll support more, but at least communicate and have a strategy. And of course that might change and evolve a little bit, but if you have a plan and you communicate it out, you're gonna save everyone a lot of pain. And some of the worst actors out there, Facebook is pretty known for deprecating things on a Friday afternoon, like something like that, where you're just like, whoa, wait, what happened? And then moving to the next version. So there's some pretty high profile ones out there. Other better actors, I would say, are like Google. They tend to have an 18-month policy, and they'll give you a good 6, 8, 9, 10-month notice, letting you know that things are going to change. And so really, it's not just about deprecation and what you deprecate, just about being a good citizen and communicating and letting people know what's going on.
Totally. And for those not familiar with deprecation policy and what we mean by deprecation in kind of technology worlds, anyone who's like installed like maybe it was a Node module and you download it from Git and you build it and it was a few years old and suddenly you get all these notices saying, warning, deprecation, and they tell you ahead of time, like in the next major version release, so not 1.1 but like 2.0, they let you know ahead of time that particular feature, that call you're going to make, or it might be a function in code or an API that you're going to call, will no longer be there. So that's a good kind of healthy behavior of pre-warning people instead of at Friday when it's going to totally break your entire automation and build tool chain, but actually letting you know ahead, like, okay, this is coming. You need to look at your code. You need to work around this, or you need to pin your policies to not use that feature somehow. At least you're forewarned as to behavior that's coming. And I much prefer to work with people who have that kind of deprecation warning ahead of time. It's a lot less stressful.
Yeah, it's and there's a lot of misconceptions about what deprecation is. I think, in an API world, it's the piece that you're really, encouraging people to bake into their businesses. And so you should give them a little warning about, when it'll happen, what the details are. Is it a path? Is it a parameter? Is it, what at a granular level, what's changing and evolving? And you'll be amazed that just having a plan and a communication strategy will stop you from actually breaking things very often, because you're thinking about these things. I would say that's one of the most important parts of having a deprecation policy and a strategy and communication is you're thinking about it. Where if you're not communicating it out, you're going to break things, and you're probably not going to always do it on purpose.
I think this leads very well into versioning as probably a good linked topic, because there's deprecation, but when's it safe to do? Like, you've got to think about the people that are consuming your APIs. And one of the mechanisms people use, instead of just nuking an endpoint and giving warning on it, is they'll actually roll a whole new version and run two parallel versions of their API, so that you can continue working on the older version knowing that it has a lifespan, but the new version's also public, meaning I can start moving my calls over to the newer published API and have a nice easy transition, instead of, like on the 28th of February, done. You're suddenly going to have to be ready for this new thing. So I like versioning as the way to do it, which just makes me then feel compelled to mention my favorite thing in the internet, semantic version, semver. Like, just if you don't know it, look that up. I take it you're also a fan of that, Kim?
Oh, yes. I mean, it gives us, ways of thinking about the major changes as well as the minor changes. And logically, it's kind of the scaffolding for that, kind of communication that I talked about around the deprecation policy. Gives you a nice way of communicating out, well, hey, we're going to add this, and then anytime you make major changes, or you're going to break things, you can signal that out and say, hey, we're going to break things, but we're doing some amazing new things. And as you said, versioning, we can support version 1 and version 2. And sure, we broke a lot of things, but hey, there's all this great stuff in version 2. We'll still support you in version 1 for this amount of time, and you have that amount of time to make the switch and clean things up on your end. So yeah, semantic versioning is a great way of moving forward the API conversation when it comes to API, when it comes to your SDKs, your code, your schemas. It's a great way of looking at things. Nice.
So what about API uptime and availability? And I know that's actually two different themes. This one's interesting. A couple of weeks ago, I was out in Denver, and I was meeting with a company that were actually explaining the way they manage availability credits. So internally, as a development organization, they actually say, we have not that we're allowed to have certain amount of downtime, they actually budget downtime and publish instead of this crazy 5 nines, which just hurt us all when the data center world went crazy for that. It stifled innovation and development and just made everyone upset. These guys actually openly publish 99.7. So they tell you you're going to be not getting this service X days a week, which means as a customer of their API, I can actually work around that and be like, hey, sometimes that might not work. So I'm going to put in my code, if it's not there, do this. But most of the time it's going to be there. And it's interesting, the reception of that behavior. People like that they're budgeting that time for innovation. Have you come across this phenomenon yourself?
Yeah, I've seen people being a little bit more honest about that. I think that's healthy because, again, communication. A lot of these things aren't black and white. It's like if you just communicate, set expectations, you'd be surprised. Most people are going to work within that. You always still have those few people who grumble, but I've seen people, budget in, say, hey, we're definitely going to be down during this window, and depending on the customer base, they might have regional or different time zone situations that they deal with, and they'll keep a version of it up for a certain region, and then they'll have downtime for this region, and they roll it that way. So definitely, I mean, have a good definition of what reliability and downtime looks like. Have a strategy, communicate it out, and you'd be surprised how people are going to love you for it.
Nice, excellent, sound advice. Managing expectations. I mean, that goes a long way. Even if the expectation's not 100% availability, at least we're forewarned and aware of what we're dealing with. And before we get on to the next kind of bullet point, and probably the last one we'll cover in this episode, which is API definition. The reason I left that last is I think when a lot of people hear API contract, that's kind of their go-to thought. None of these other kind of behavioral type things, but that's an important thing about API contracts. It's not just here's my endpoints and they're going to stand up to X transactions a second, which is what we've tested. Like that's the old school way of kind of just performance testing and publishing a data sheet, which was fine in infrastructure world when all I was doing was standing up a port and saying, should work at this level, have a nice day. Whereas this is a combination of definitions and performance and just how we're going to treat you. That's kind of, I think, to me, is like the most important takeaway for the API contract. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. It's I mean, I think a lot of people see that, old school WSDL, the new school Swagger Open API as the legal code for what that contract is. But as you said, there's a lot of other human elements. But yeah, I would say that Open API definition with JSON schema is kind of the heart of that contract. It definitely lays out, every little letter of what that contract has, what, the paths, the parameters, what's expected. And it's another good reason for doing Open API. I mean, most people still call it Swagger, and the reason why they call it Swagger is because they see it as Swagger UI or the documentation. So why you do this contract is for documentation, and then secondarily because it's got JSON schema, you'll be doing some validation and testing on it. And a lot of people see that as the API contract, but really the Open API is how we communicate that contract between providers and consumers. But it's also how we as a team, when we're developing an API, can communicate what we mean. When we add a parameter or add a header or change that schema, rather than just saying, hey, add, description to that schema, I can actually give you a little Open API snippet and say, here's what I mean. And it really helps, get rid of a lot of these misconceptions and communication breakdowns that exist within development teams. So Open API is not just a way of externally describing your contract. It's a way of internally, defining what that contract is, and that can really be attached to each of those version releases, as we talked about. It can drive your documentation. It can drive your testing. It can drive your security, fuzzing, scanning. There's a lot of things that Open API contract can do, but most importantly, it really articulates every detail of what you're going to be offering as part of that API service to your consumers.
So on the API definition side, just while I was listening to you explain it there, I immediately started thinking of unit testing with like Mocha and Chai, and we do this for the functions inside the code, and really what we've provided here with, and I apologize, I'm one of the people that keeps calling it Swagger still. I know, bad, Nathan. But with OpenAPI, effectively, that's what we're doing, though, is we're opening up that testing to also being the last mile as well. Like we're saying that if you send this endpoint is going to give you a Boolean, and it's going to expect these methods of what you can send to it. And if I know all of those things, then when I write my code, I can actually make my code test against the published schema before ever even talking to your service. So you guys have that's that kind of programmatic contract that I've got from you. If you've done the right thing, use JSON schema and OpenAPI. And with awesome tools out there, I mean, I've been doing a bit of work for a few months now with AJV, another JSON validator. But if I have that in my code and it's doing the validation before it tries to configure the backend, I'm already cutting out any bad inputs because it's already doing things like saying this value needs to be an IP4 address format, so it's not going to even try and pass through any nasty stuff. So doing all these schemas up front actually and publishing them and saying we will work if you adhere to this, I can bring that into my code and be way more confident in the behavior that I'm going to get if I have a versioned schema. So yeah.
Yeah.
Everything you just said.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned Mocha and Chai, and they have a notion of assertions. Yeah. You know, it's your tests. You have these assertions about what that API should do, and technical people see those assertions as very technical. But if you step back, I'll often push developers to create a list. You know, give plain language names to those assertions. Like, what is it supposed to do? And so that you can communicate that to a business user. I mean, this API should return a list of products, should allow me to add an order to my shopping cart. It should, you know, average business assertions about what technology should do for us. And honestly, if your API cannot deliver on those, you shouldn't be doing this. And so these technical assertions and tests that we build from the definitions, from the schema, can really, you know, drive the business end of the contract and actually feed into something that average people can understand and help bridge that divide that often exists between technical folk and the normals, you know. And so I really think that's an important aspect of the API contract is sure, yes, have all your definitions and have those assertions and tests in place, but make sure they actually speak to the business objectives and the end goal, because this is why we're doing APIs, is to kind of bring us out of our technical bubbles and deliver to our customers and help us generate revenue, you know, that keeps our paychecks coming in.
On technical folk and muggles, I can't believe I'm still
making I like that, muggles.
I'm well aware of how lame that was. That just happened. Yes, muggles are people who don't do API contracts and good definitions of schema.
But they can call your boss and scream and yell, and some of them have some control and power. So.
Yeah, indeed. So we just picked off a couple, like the ones that really stand out for me. Was there any kind of advice on API contracts I missed there that I maybe should have highlighted?
So there's lots of other technical details we could think about, but and have a discussion of, and some legal ones too. But I really think how you opened it up about this being parenting and really gets at the human side of the contract, because this is why we do APIs, is to provide an interface for our consumers, our customers, to apply these resources, whether it be data, content, algorithmic, and apply them. That's an API, application programming interface, and people tend to think application as mobile or just web, but it really is about applying those resources that we're making available through those interfaces. It's not it could be devices, it could be web, mobile, it could be a spreadsheet. There's a lot of ways people get at these resources. And if our APIs don't have a contract and don't have a contract that speak to those consumer needs, none of this really matters. And we've all seen lots of APIs that are just so technical, and someone just checked the box, and developer said, here you go, publish them, use them, whatever, I don't care. And that's not API. That's old school. And we don't do that anymore. In the cloud, in this new age, web age, you got to make it speak to the average business user. And for me, APIs, anybody should be able to land on a developer portal, look down the list of APIs, and understand generally what they do. They may not get all the technical details, and then they should be able to find a contract or pass that off to a developer, to their, someone in their company, and actually integrate with those and know that contract's going to be, met in someone's home when it needs to be supported, when, there's other issues going on, as we said, deprecation and roadmap. So really that human side of the contract is the most important piece, I think.
Nice. Really appreciate that summary. So, I mean, if I were to shorten this whole thing down to like the elevator pitch, we only have 4 floors in HQ 401 building, so it's a pretty quick elevator pitch. I would have to say, don't be an API muggle. Practice good API parenting. I think that's like the one sentence kind of here. And then somehow squeeze all the bullet points in that we talked about after that. So,
amen. Because at some point down the road, those of us who have older kids know your kids start behaving like you and remind you of you. You're like, oh man, that's me. So you want to, be on your best behavior, and good parenting is important.
Nice. Excellent message. I have a 9-week-old. If he starts making muggle jokes, I will consider myself to have failed. So generation should be past that one, I would hope. Timeless stories, of course, J.K. Rowling. I'm kidding. I love them. You've been listening to another episode of REDtalks.live, your home of ranting engineers and DevOps. Thank you again, Kin. I'm sure there's many other awesome topics we're going to talk about regarding APIs in the future, but I appreciate you coming on.
Thanks as always for having me, sir. Look forward to the next one.
Awesome, buddy. We'll talk soon. That was Kin Lane, and I am Nathan Pierce. Thanks for listening.